The sun rose over Ulithi Atoll on the morning of August 16, 1945, painting the lagoon in shades of copper and gold. The air hung thick with salt and aviation fuel. Across 20 square miles of protected water, more than 700 American warships lay at anchor, battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, auxiliaries, a fleet larger than all the navies of Europe combined. Maintenance crews moved along the decks. Supply barges chugged between hulls. The smell of diesel mixed with the rot of jungle vegetation from the surrounding islands. For months, this obscure ring of coral in the Caroline Islands had served as the United States Navy's primary forward staging base for the assault on Japan. Now, with the war ending, the anchorage fell silent in a way that felt almost unnatural. The rhythm of war had stopped, but the machines of war remained. 1900 miles to the east, on Enewetak Atoll, similar stillness descended. Engineers who had built runways, fuel farms, and ammunition depots stood idle, awaiting orders that had not yet arrived. The same paralysis gripped Kwajalein, Majuro, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, Manus Island, and dozens of other specks of land scattered across the Central and South Pacific. During the war, the United States had transformed these remote islands into the sinews of a transoceanic war machine, bases that allowed American forces to project power across distances that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. They were marvels of logistical engineering, each one a self-contained city rising from coral and jungle, harbors blasted and dredged from reef, airstrips carved from limestone and volcanic rock, tank farms holding millions of gallons of fuel, hospitals with hundreds of beds, power plants, water distillation units, repair shops capable of rebuilding aircraft engines or ship turbines. They were monuments to American industrial power and organizational genius. And now they sat empty, or nearly so. The men who had built them and fought from them did not yet know what would become of these places. Most assumed they would simply be abandoned, left to rust and return to jungle. But the story of what actually happened to America's Pacific Island bases after World War II is far stranger and more consequential than anyone aboard those ships in August 1945 could have imagined. It is a story woven from Cold War paranoia, nuclear fire, environmental catastrophe, and geopolitical calculation. It is a story that reveals how victory in war creates problems that are, in some ways, more complex than war itself. And it is a story that remains unfinished, because the legacy of these bases, some abandoned, some expanded, some obliterated, still shapes the Pacific today, 8 decades later. To understand what happened after the war, one must first grasp what the bases represented during it. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States faced a strategic dilemma that bordered on the impossible. Japanese forces occupied or controlled nearly every significant island group between Hawaii and the Asian mainland, the Marshalls, the Carolines, the Marianas, the Philippines. American territory in the Pacific consisted of Hawaii, a few atolls held by handfuls of Marines, and the vulnerable West Coast. The distance between San Francisco and Tokyo measured nearly 5,500 miles. No navy in history had sustained combat operations across such an expanse. The tyranny of distance seemed absolute. Yet within 3 years, American forces had not only crossed the Pacific but had established a network of bases that allowed them to strangle Japanese supply lines, obliterate Japanese cities from the air, and position themselves for an invasion of the home islands. This achievement rested on 2 pillars: industrial capacity and engineering audacity. American shipyards produced more tonnage in 1944 alone than Japan built during the entire war. American factories turned out cargo planes, construction equipment, and prefabricated base components at rates that defied comprehension. But capacity meant nothing without forward positions from which to employ it. The bases were the answer. Consider Ulithi. Before the war, it appeared on few maps and hosted a population of perhaps 500 Micronesian islanders who fished the lagoon and harvested coconuts. When American forces seized the atoll in September 1944, they found a near-perfect natural harbor, large, deep, protected, but nothing else. No port facilities. No infrastructure. Within weeks, the Navy transformed it into the largest forward anchorage in the world. Floating dry docks arrived, each one capable of lifting a cruiser from the water for hull repairs. Ammunition barges brought in shells, bombs, and torpedoes by the thousands of tons. Tankers pumped fuel oil and aviation gasoline into storage vessels. Hospital ships tended to the wounded. Service squadrons performed maintenance that would have required a return to Pearl Harbor or even the mainland. By early 1945, Ulithi hosted more naval tonnage than any harbor on Earth, including New York or London. The entire operation depended on mobility and improvisation, the ability to create a functioning city from nothing, using ships and prefabricated components, in a matter of weeks. Other bases served different purposes. Tinian, in the Marianas, became the busiest airfield in the world. The island measured only 12 miles long and 6 miles wide, but American engineers covered it with 4 parallel runways, each more than 8,000 feet in length, and hundreds of hardstands for B-29 Superfortress bombers. At peak operations, a B-29 took off from Tinian every 45 seconds. The aircraft that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki flew from Tinian. Manus Island, in the Admiralty Islands north of New Guinea, served as a major repair and resupply hub for the 7th Fleet. Kwajalein became a sprawling logistics node and submarine base. Guam, the only pre-war American territory recaptured during the war, grew into a headquarters complex and air base. Each installation required thousands of men, millions of tons of material, and an organizational framework that treated distance and terrain as problems to be solved through sheer application of resources. The Japanese military leadership, watching this expansion with a mixture of awe and horror, recognized that they faced not just a more powerful enemy but a different kind of enemy, one whose concept of warfare rested on abundance rather than scarcity, on logistics rather than elan, on the grinding accumulation of material advantage rather than the decisive battle. Japanese doctrine emphasized spirit, sacrifice, and the climactic engagement that would turn the tide. American doctrine emphasized supply chains, fuel tonnages, and the inexorable forward movement of bases that devoured space and time. The bases represented a philosophical difference as much as a material one. They were the physical manifestation of a society that believed any problem could be solved if enough resources were applied in an organized fashion. When the war ended, this vast infrastructure became, overnight, a strategic question mark. The United States had invested billions of dollars and immense labor in constructing these bases. Thousands of Americans had died capturing the islands on which they stood. Yet their wartime purpose had evaporated. Japan was defeated, occupied, disarmed. No other enemy threatened American interests in the Pacific. Demobilization began immediately. Within months, millions of servicemen returned home. The great fleets that had crowded Ulithi and Manus dispersed. Hundreds of ships went into reserve or were scrapped. The momentum of war reversed with dizzying speed. In Washington, planners confronted a paradox. The bases had proven their value in wartime, but maintaining them in peacetime seemed wasteful and unnecessary. Many were remote, expensive to supply, and of questionable strategic use in a world where Japan no longer posed a threat. Yet abandoning them entirely felt reckless, particularly as tensions with the Soviet Union began to rise. The question was not simply whether to keep the bases, but which ones, for what purposes, and at what cost. Different agencies offered different answers. The Navy wanted to retain major installations that could support fleet operations in the event of future conflict. The Army Air Forces, soon to become the Independent Air Force, sought bases for long-range bombers and airlift operations. The State Department worried about the political implications of maintaining a quasi-colonial presence across the Pacific. Budget officials demanded cuts. The result was a sorting process driven by strategic calculation, bureaucratic inertia, and expediency. A handful of bases grew into permanent installations. Others were placed in caretaker status, maintained at minimal levels by small detachments. Many were simply abandoned, their equipment cannibalized for spare parts, their structures left to decay. The decisions were not always logical or consistent. They reflected the chaotic transition from total war to uncertain peace, and the fact that no one in 1945 or 1946 could predict what the next decade would bring. Guam became the anchor of America's continued presence in the Western Pacific. Its status as a pre-war U.S. territory gave it a legal and political foundation that other bases lacked. The Navy expanded the facilities at Opera Harbor into a major deep-water port capable of servicing carriers and submarines. Anderson Air Force Base, built during the war, remained operational and grew into a strategic bomber base. Guam's location, roughly 1,500 miles east of the Philippines and 1,300 miles south of Japan, made it a natural hub for projecting power into East Asia. By 1950, the island hosted thousands of military personnel and their dependents, along with a growing civilian infrastructure. Guam evolved from a wartime base into a permanent outpost, a fragment of American territory embedded in the Pacific. Kwajalein Atoll, in the Marshall Islands, followed a different trajectory. The Navy retained control of the lagoon and a small portion of the land, but most of the wartime facilities were mothballed. The atoll's strategic value remained ambiguous until the late 1950s, when it was repurposed as a missile testing range. The vast lagoon and remote location made it ideal for tracking intercontinental ballistic missiles fired from California, nearly 5,000 miles away. Kwajalein became, and remains, a key node in America's nuclear deterrent infrastructure, though few Americans know it exists. Tinian, despite its importance during the war, was largely abandoned. The massive airfields fell silent. Jungle reclaimed the runways. The island reverted to a sleepy backwater, its wartime significance fading into memory. Decades later, portions of the base were revived as the U.S. military sought to distribute forces more widely across the Pacific, but for most of the Cold War, Tinian represented what happened to bases that lost their strategic rationale. They disappeared. Ulithi, that marvel of logistical improvisation, was abandoned almost entirely. Without a permanent harbor or infrastructure on land, the atoll offered little peacetime utility. The floating dry docks and service vessels departed. The lagoon returned to the control of the Micronesian islanders who had lived there for centuries. Today, Ulithi is barely known outside of historical studies. Nothing visible remains of the base that once anchored the world's largest fleet. But the most dramatic and troubling fate awaited certain bases selected for a new and terrible purpose: nuclear testing. The advent of the atomic bomb transformed strategic thinking in ways that extended far beyond the immediate end of the war. American military planners, grappling with the implications of nuclear weapons, sought to understand their effects on ships, aircraft, structures, and personnel. They needed test sites that were remote, secure, and expendable. The Pacific Islands, particularly those in the Marshall Islands, fit the criteria perfectly. In early 1946, the residents of Bikini Atoll were asked, though the request was less a question than an inevitability, to relocate so that their homeland could be used for atomic tests. The islanders, numbering fewer than 200, agreed, believing they would return. They never did. On July 1, 1946, an atomic bomb designated Able was detonated above a fleet of surplus warships anchored in Bikini Lagoon. The blast, equivalent to 23,000 tons of TNT, sank or damaged numerous vessels and irradiated the surrounding environment. 3 weeks later, a second bomb, Baker, was detonated underwater, producing a massive column of radioactive water that drenched the target fleet and contaminated everything it touched. Newsreel cameras captured the tests, and images of the mushroom clouds rising over palm-fringed atolls became iconic symbols of the atomic age. Bikini was only the beginning. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States conducted 67 nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands, most of them at Bikini and Enewetak atolls. The tests included the first hydrogen bomb, detonated at Enewetak in 1952, and the catastrophic Castle Bravo shot at Bikini in 1954, which yielded 15 megatons, more than twice the predicted force, and spread radioactive fallout across hundreds of miles. Inhabited islands downwind, including Rongelap and Uterik, were contaminated. Residents suffered radiation sickness, thyroid cancers, and birth defects. The fishermen aboard the Japanese vessel Lucky Dragon 5, 80 miles from the blast, were exposed to lethal doses of fallout. One died. The incident caused an international outcry and forced the U.S. to confront the global consequences of its testing program. The transformation of former military bases into nuclear proving grounds revealed an uncomfortable truth: the infrastructure built to win the war could be repurposed in ways that inflicted new forms of suffering. The islanders who had endured Japanese occupation during the war, then welcomed American forces as liberators, found themselves displaced, irradiated, and forgotten. The atolls themselves were rendered uninhabitable for decades, their lagoons filled with radioactive debris, their soil poisoned. In the 1970s, the U.S. government attempted to decontaminate Enewetak by scraping up thousands of cubic yards of contaminated soil and burying it in a massive concrete dome on Runit Island. The dome, officially known as the Runit Dome but locally called the Tomb, remains a symbol of the atomic legacy. It leaks. Sea level rise threatens to crack it open further, potentially releasing plutonium into the ocean. Parallel to the nuclear testing program, other bases entered a state of suspended animation. Manus Island, once a bustling repair hub, was handed over to Australian administration as part of the territory of New Guinea. The base facilities deteriorated rapidly in the tropical climate. By the 1960s, little remained except rusting Quonset huts and overgrown roads. Poliliu, site of one of the war's bloodiest battles, retained some U.S. presence during the initial post-war years, but it too was eventually abandoned. The jungle swallowed the airstrips and bunkers. Today, the island is part of the independent nation of Palau, and tourists visit to see the wreckage of war, tanks, amphibious vehicles, artillery pieces, left to rust among the trees. The fate of each base reflected a combination of strategic need, political pressure, and budgetary constraints, but underlying all these factors was a deeper reality. The United States had built a Pacific empire by accident, not by design. Unlike European colonial powers, which had spent centuries consolidating control over overseas territories, the U.S. had acquired its Pacific bases in a 3-year sprint driven by wartime necessity. When the war ended, there was no coherent imperial strategy, no tradition of colonial administration, no long-term vision for what these bases should become. The result was a patchwork of decisions. Some bases retained, others abandoned, a few transformed into sites of nuclear horror. This ad hoc approach had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate post-war years. The bases that remained operational became focal points for America's Cold War strategy in the Pacific. Guam, for instance, served as a major staging area during the Vietnam War. B-52 bombers flying from Andersen Air Force Base conducted round-the-clock strikes over Southeast Asia. The island's population swelled, and its economy became almost entirely dependent on the military. Okinawa, not covered in this narrative but part of the same strategic framework, became the linchpin of U.S. forces in the Western Pacific, hosting tens of thousands of troops and sparking decades of local resentment over noise, crime, and environmental damage. The abandoned bases, meanwhile, left physical and social scars. Rusting fuel tanks leaked petroleum into coral reefs. Unexploded ordnance, bombs, shells, grenades, remained buried in the soil, killing or maiming islanders who stumbled upon them decades later. The environmental damage was extensive and largely ignored until the late 20th century, when increasing awareness of ecological issues forced a reckoning. The U.S. military had treated the islands as disposable assets, useful during the war but expendable afterward. The cleanup costs, measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars, were never fully budgeted or acknowledged. Yet there is another dimension to this story, one that complicates any simple narrative of negligence or exploitation. The bases, for all the damage they caused, also brought benefits that reshaped the Pacific. The roads, airstrips, and ports built during the war became foundations for post-war development. Islanders who worked for the U.S. military acquired skills and education that elevated their communities. Medical care, introduced by American forces, reduced infant mortality and increased life expectancy. The economic injection, even after the bases closed, left lasting effects. This does not excuse the displacement, radiation exposure, or environmental destruction, but it reminds us that history is rarely simple. The same infrastructure that enabled nuclear tests also connected remote islands to the wider world. The same military presence that imposed foreign control also brought resources that would not have arrived otherwise. Nowhere is this ambivalence clearer than in the Marshalls. The nuclear testing inflicted catastrophic harm, yet the Compact of Free Association, signed in 1986, provided the Marshallese people with financial compensation, access to U.S. services, and the right to live and work in the United States without a visa. Thousands of Marshallese have emigrated, forming communities in Arkansas, Washington, and Hawaii. The relationship remains fraught. Many Marshallese feel the compensation is inadequate, and health problems from radiation continue, but it is a relationship, not an abandonment. The bases, even in their absence, bind the United States and these islands together. Meanwhile, geopolitical realities continue to shape the fate of the bases. In recent years, as China has expanded its influence in the Pacific, the U.S. military has revisited the strategic value of islands it once abandoned. Tinian, mothballed for decades, is being eyed for new military facilities to counter Chinese expansion. Palau, despite its small size and fragile ecosystem, has become a focal point of competition between Washington and Beijing. The Cold War may have ended, but the contest for the Pacific has not. The bases that seemed irrelevant in 1950 or 1990 suddenly matter again in 2020. History, it seems, does not move in straight lines. The recurring symbol in this story, the one object that threads through the narrative from the height of the war to the present day, is the fuel drum. 55 gallons of steel, painted olive drab or navy gray, stamped with procurement codes and shipping dates. During the war, millions of these drums passed through the Pacific bases, carrying the gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel that powered the American advance. They were stacked on beaches, loaded onto barges, distributed to airstrips and anchorages. When empty, they were repurposed, cut in half to make wash basins, fashioned into stoves, used as building materials. They were ubiquitous, utilitarian, and emblematic of the logistical machine that won the war. After the war, the fuel drums remained. Thousands of them, rusting on beaches, half buried in sand, tumbled into lagoons. They became monuments to abandonment, markers of a presence that had moved on. In the 1990s, environmental surveys of former base sites found fuel drums everywhere, many of them still containing residue that leached into the soil and water. Cleanup crews removed them by the hundreds, but many remain. On Tinian, drums lie scattered in the jungle near the old airfields. On Kwajalein, they wash up on beaches after storms. On Peleliu, they rust beside Japanese pillboxes, twin relics of the war. The fuel drum, then, is a symbol of abundance and waste, of the power that built the bases and the negligence that left them to rot. It represents America's capacity to mobilize resources on a scale that overwhelmed its enemies, but also its tendency to move on without cleaning up the mess. The drums are still there, corroding slowly, a physical reminder that the bases never truly ended, they simply transformed into ruins, environmental hazards, and geopolitical pawns. 75 years after the end of World War II, the question of what happened to America's Pacific Island bases has no single answer. Some bases evolved into permanent installations, anchoring American military power across the ocean. Others were consumed by nuclear fire, their atolls rendered uninhabitable by the very weapons they helped develop. Many were simply abandoned, left to decay in the tropical heat, their wartime significance fading into historical footnote. A few have been resurrected as new strategic needs emerge. But the deeper truth is that the bases never really went away. They persist in the environment, in the radioactive soil and unexploded bombs. They persist in the social fabric, in the lives of islanders who were displaced or irradiated or employed. They persist in the geopolitical architecture of the Pacific, which remains shaped by the infrastructure laid down during the war. And they persist in the American imagination, as symbols of a moment when the nation's industrial power seemed limitless, its global reach unchallengeable, its future assured. The story of the bases is a story of victory's aftermath, the messy, complicated, often ugly process of figuring out what to do with the tools of triumph once the enemy has surrendered. It is a story of strategic brilliance and moral blindness, of engineering marvels and environmental catastrophe, of connections forged and communities shattered. It is a story that refuses to end neatly, because the bases themselves refuse to disappear. They haunt the Pacific still, in ruins and in use, reminders that winning a war is only the beginning of the story. On a quiet morning in the Marshalls, a rusted fuel drum bobs in the shallows off an unnamed islet, half submerged in water that glows turquoise in the sunlight. Inside the drum, a few ounces of petroleum shimmer in a rainbow slick. The steel is paper-thin now, eaten away by decades of saltwater. Soon the drum will collapse entirely, spilling its contents into the lagoon, adding one more invisible layer to the sediment of history. But for now, it floats, a small monument to abundance and waste, to power and forgetting, to the strange fate of the bases that won the war and then outlived their purpose, decaying slowly under the Pacific sun.